In the heart of a serene suburban neighborhood stood a picturesque two-story home, lovingly adorned with flourishing flowers and lush greenery. The laughter of children echoed from the backyard, their innocent giggles resonating with pure joy. This was the home of the Williams family, a family seemingly chiseled from the model of perfection. The patriarch of this blissful unit was David Williams, a man who was as kind-hearted as he was diligent. With a steady job as an engineer, David had always provided for his family, ensuring their comfort and security. Every morning, before heading off to work, he'd plant a gentle kiss on his wife's forehead and ruffle the kids' hair. His departure met with a chorus of goodbyes and I love yous. David's wife, Emily, was the heart of the household. A part-time school teacher and a full-time mother, she was a beacon of warmth and care. Her laughter was contagious, her love was unconditional, and her dedication to her family was unshakable. She was the sun around which their little world revolved. The couple was blessed with 3 beautiful children, each unique and special in their own way. The eldest, Matthew, was a curious 14-year-old with a fascination for everything science. His bright mind and sparkling eyes held the promise of a brilliant future. The middle child, Amelia, a thoughtful 10-year-old, loved nothing more than to lose herself in the enchanting realms of storybooks, her imagination as vast as the ocean. The youngest, Sam, at 6 years old, was an inexhaustible bundle of energy with a contagious laugh and the purest heart. The Williams family led a life that most would deem ideal. Weekdays were a seamless blend of school, work, and home-cooked meals around the dining table, where they'd share stories from their day. Weekends were reserved for cherished family activities, picnics in the park, movie nights, trips to the museum, and the occasional beach outing. Laughter, love, and warmth filled their home, creating an atmosphere of bliss that would make anyone envious. As the sun set each evening, painting the sky with hues of fiery orange and passionate red, David would tuck his children into bed, kissing them goodnight. He would then retire to the sanctuary of his bedroom, sharing hushed conversations with Emily before sleep took over. They would drift off to slumber wrapped in each other's arms, the promise of another beautiful day ahead of them. Little did they know, their tranquil routine was on the brink of change, as something sinister loomed in the not-so-distant future. But for now, all was well, and life was simply perfect. David Williams had always been a man of logic and reason. As an engineer, his mind was trained to dissect, analyze, and find solutions to the most complex problems. His dreams, generally, were reflective of this rational demeanor, often a jumbled mess of numbers, equations, and project designs. Yet, one fateful night, this norm would shatter, replaced by a nightmare so dreadful it would leave him gasping for air. As darkness draped over their serene suburban home, David, as usual, kissed his children goodnight and embraced Emily before surrendering himself to sleep. However, this night was to be anything but ordinary. As he drifted off to the peaceful lullaby of Emily's rhythmic breathing beside him, an ominous chill creeped into his dreams. He found himself standing outside their lovely home, except now it was engulfed in monstrous, raging flames. The once cheerful walls were reduced to an angry inferno, its hungry tongues licking the evening sky, belching out dark, toxic smoke that blotted out the moon. The cozy home he cherished was now a horrifying spectacle of destruction and chaos. But the flames were not the worst part of the nightmare. What haunted him the most were the screams, the harrowing, bone-chilling screams of his family trapped inside. Matthew's pleading cries, Amelia's terrified shrieks, Sam's wailing sobs, and Emily's agonized calls for help, each resonated with a terror so raw that it sent a crippling chill down David's spine. They were sounds he would never forget, sounds that would come to haunt his waking hours. Frozen in fear, he could only watch helplessly as the house crumbled, each timber cracking and falling, echoing the heartbreaking loss he was enduring. His legs felt heavy, his mind numbed by the horrendous scene playing out in front of him. He wanted to move, to save his family, but he was paralyzed, trapped in this terrifying reality. He jolted awake, his body drenched in a cold sweat, his heart pounding against his ribs like a terrified bird trying to escape a cage. The haunting echoes of his family's screams still rang in his ears, sending shivers down his spine. He glanced over at Emily sleeping peacefully next to him, then tiptoed to the kids' rooms, reassuring himself that they were safe and sound. His nightmare had been so vivid, so real, he needed to see his family, to touch them, to assure himself that it was just a terrible dream. But as he settled back into bed, his heart still racing, he couldn't shake off the unsettling dread that had seeped into his bones. His life, as he knew it, was about to change, and this was just the beginning of a series of nightmares that would torment him, challenging his sanity and shaking the very foundations of his perfect life. Sleep, which used to be David's refuge from the day's stress and worries, had turned into a dreadful ordeal. Every night, as he closed his eyes, the same horrifying scene would unfold. His peaceful slumber would morph into an infernal nightmare, a relentless replay of the terrifying house fire and the unbearable screams of his family. He'd find himself standing in front of his burning home, the fiery hell consuming everything he held dear. The golden flames, fanned by an invisible force, leaped high into the darkness, the home he'd built with love and care turning into a nightmarish vision of hell on earth. But the flames were not what scared him the most. It was the screams, the blood-curdling screams of his trapped family, that truly tore at his soul. Each wail of terror, each call for help, was a stabbing pain in his heart. Matthew's cries were frantic and terrified, his adolescent voice strained with desperation. Amelia's high-pitched shrieks pierced the night, a horrible testament to her fear. Little Sam's sobs were heartbreaking, his young voice filled with confusion and terror. Emily's calls were the most agonizing, her voice filled with unbearable pain and despair as she screamed for him, for their children. Try as he might, he could never reach them. It was as if an unseen force held him in place, his legs heavy as lead, his every attempt to move forward thwarted. He would stretch out his hands, shouting their names, his voice lost in the roaring fire. Each plea for him to save them, each cry of agony, amplified his helplessness. He would wake up, drenched in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest like a wild drum. The afterimage of the inferno and the echoes of the screams would linger, making him question if he was still trapped in that terrifying dreamscape. As the days passed, the nightmares became more vivid, more real. He could smell the acrid scent of the burning wood, feel the scorching heat of the flames, and hear the crackling of the fire as it devoured their home. He could see the despair in Emily's eyes, hear the fear in his children's voices, feel their pain as if it were his own. Despite his desperate attempts to protect his family, his recurring nightmare underlined his impotence against the impending catastrophe. His inability to act, to save his loved ones, weighed heavily on him. It was a horrifying sensation, a dark dread that kept him on edge, even in his waking hours. Sleep had become a battleground, a realm of terror where he was doomed to witness his family's tragic end. Night after night, the screams in the dark, a chilling symphony of his worst fears, come alive. In the aftermath of his nightly horror, David found a renewed sense of appreciation for his family. The nightmares had underscored the ephemeral nature of life, and with each daybreak, he felt an overwhelming gratitude for his loved ones being safe and sound. Every morning, he would hold Emily a little longer, his eyes lingering on her peaceful face. He'd watch the children sleep a few moments more, his heart brimming with love and gratitude. Every day became a mission to create memories, to cherish the mundane moments. Each breakfast was a feast, each laughter a melody, each shared story a treasure. David, usually the one to rush through his morning routine, began to slow down. He relished in the morning chaos, the battle over the bathroom, the hustle of packing lunches, and the last-minute homework rush. These scenes, once routine, now took on a new, precious significance. The weekends, once reserved for rest and leisure, became opportunities for adventure. David would plan trips to the amusement park, hikes in the mountains, or picnics by the lake. He watched with unadulterated joy as Matthew tried to explain the science behind the roller coaster, Amelia sketched the surrounding nature, and Sam gleefully chased after butterflies. Every smile, every excited squeal, every wide-eyed moment of wonder was a balm to his tormented heart. Even his time with Emily changed. Their conversations became deeper, their laughter louder, their shared silence more comforting. He'd often catch himself just watching her as she read a book, prepared dinner, or played with their kids. He'd memorize the curve of her smile, the spark in her eyes, the sound of her laughter, like he was afraid he'd forget. At night, as the children drifted off to sleep, he would hold each one a bit tighter, whispering an extra "I love you" before turning off the lights. Back in their room, he'd pull Emily closer, their whispered conversations lingering into the night. Despite the looming dread that gripped him each night, David found solace in these cherished moments. They were his escape, his shield against the terror that awaited him in his dreams. He held on to these moments, these precious fragments of normalcy, like a lifeline. He clung to the reality of his family's presence, their laughter, their love, a stark contrast to the horror that awaited him in the realm of sleep. For in the end, it was these cherished moments that gave him the strength to face another night, another nightmare. Despite the solace David found in the waking moments with his family, the nightmares refused to relent. They were inescapable, looming at the edge of his consciousness like a monstrous shadow waiting to swallow him whole. Each night, he'd succumb to the terror, the hellish fire, and the agonizing screams of his loved ones. The nightmares began to seep into his days, casting a gloomy pall over his precious moments with his family. The laughter and joy were interspersed with moments of paralyzing fear. The sight of Emily cooking in the kitchen would remind him of the flames. Matthew's science experiments would echo with the crackling fire. Amelia's art would be stained with the red and orange hues of the blaze. Sam's playful antics would trigger the memory of his terrified sobs. It was a cruel dichotomy, his reality marred by the horrifying visions of his dreams. With each recurring nightmare, his mental health began to deteriorate. He was frequently lost in thought, his usually sharp eyes clouded with worry and fear. He began to wear a mask of normalcy, forcing smiles and laughter while hiding the torment that was slowly consuming him. His work suffered as he was unable to concentrate. his thoughts persistently straying back to the fire and the screams. His once clear and analytical mind was now a whirlpool of fear and anxiety. He started to withdraw from his colleagues, his friends, finding it difficult to share or articulate his fear. The relentless nightmares started to affect his physical health as well. He had trouble sleeping, fearing the nightmare that awaited him, leading to insomnia. Dark circles under his eyes, a pale complexion, and a loss of appetite became his constant companions. He would often startle at the smallest noise, his nerves on edge, his heart perpetually pounding in his chest. Despite his valiant attempts to protect his family from his torment, Emily began to notice the changes in him. The light in his eyes was dimming, his smile rarely reaching his eyes, his laughter hollow. Yet, he would dismiss her concerns, assuring her he was fine while he continued to grapple with his own terror. As each day melded into the next, the line between his nightmare and reality started to blur. His life was caught in a vicious cycle, the inescapable terror of his dreams, followed by the respite of his waking hours. He was a man teetering on the edge, wrestling with a terror that was slowly but surely threatening to consume his sanity and the happiness of his cherished family life. With each recurring nightmare, David began to notice a disturbing consistency. Amid the chaos of the flames, the terror of the screams, and the sheer horror of the situation, one detail remained unchanging. The fire always happened on the same date, August 8th. It was a date that had initially seemed irrelevant, just another facet of his horrifying dreams. But as the nightmare persisted, the date began to echo in his mind, becoming a haunting refrain to the terrifying melody of his nightly horror. He started to contemplate this peculiarity, poring over it during his waking hours. Why was the date so prominent in his nightmares? It held no significant meaning in his life, no anniversaries, no birthdays. Yet, in his dreams, it was a death sentence, a day of unspeakable tragedy. As the date in reality drew closer, a chilling possibility began to take shape in his mind. Could his nightmares be premonitions of the future? The very thought sent shivers down his spine, but he couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion. The consistent date, the vividness of his dreams, the intense emotions he experienced all pointed towards a dreadful prophetic revelation. The realization filled him with a paralyzing fear, but at the same time, it sparked a glimmer of hope. If these nightmares were indeed a glimpse into the future, then he had the power to change it. He had the chance to save his family from the fate that his dreams predicted. His thoughts became consumed with this revelation. He pored over every detail of his nightmare, trying to find clues, hints that might help him change the course of events. The image of his burning house, the terrified screams of his family, the futile attempts to save them, each detail took on a new, sinister meaning. He grappled with the enormity of his revelation, his days filled with frantic planning and his nights with horrifying visions of a future he was desperate to change. Yet, as the date drew closer, his resolve only strengthened. If his nightmares were indeed premonitions of the future, then he was armed with the knowledge that might be the only thing standing between his family and the impending tragedy. He would do whatever it took to prevent his horrifying dreams from becoming a terrifying reality. As the date etched in his nightmares finally dawned, David was prepared. He had taken a leave of absence from work and planned a surprise outing for his family. He intended to keep them far from the house, far from the flames that haunted his dreams. It was a desperate plan, a futile attempt to outwit destiny, but he had to try. The alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. He woke his family early, feigning enthusiasm for the surprise outing. Their excited faces, the sparkle in Emily's eyes, and the children's squeals of delight did little to quell the panic gnawing at his insides. But he held his terror at bay, painting on a smile, determined to give his family a memorable day. He drove them to a beautiful resort nestled in the mountains, far from the reach of his nightmare. The day was spent in laughter and joy, filled with hikes, picnics, and games. They swam in the clear mountain streams, dined under the open sky, and shared stories around a bonfire. The natural beauty of their surroundings, the warmth of their shared joy, and the love that resonated between them seemed to create a protective bubble around them, warding off the doom that David feared. He watched as Matthew tried to catch fish in the stream, his face scrunched up in concentration. He laughed as Amelia and Sam engaged in a tickle war, their laughter echoing through the serene mountains. And he held Emily close as they watched the sun set, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. The fear never left him, lurking in the back of his mind like a persistent shadow. Every ticking minute, every passing hour brought him closer to the time when his house would be engulfed in flames and his nightmares. But he held on to the hope that his actions, his desperate plan, might change their fate. As the night fell and the dreaded hour passed, David felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. They were safe. His nightmare hadn't come true. He had successfully averted the unthinkable. His family, his world, was safe. With the weight of impending doom lifted off his shoulders, they returned home the following day, their hearts filled with the memories of a wonderful time spent together. But little did David know, this was merely the calm before the storm. The battle against his horrifying premonitions was far from over. Exhausted but elated, David returned home with his family, his heart heavy with the day's joy and relief. He hoped that having successfully prevented the disaster, the nightmare that had haunted him would finally cease. That night, he went to sleep for the first time in weeks without the fear gnawing at his insides. But as he drifted off to sleep, the horrifying dream returned, stronger and more vivid than ever. The smell of smoke was more pungent, the heat more searing, and the screams more chilling. The fire seemed to taunt him, its dancing flames mimicking his failure. His family was there, just as before, trapped in the all-consuming inferno. He woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The chilling realization hit him like a sledgehammer. The nightmare hadn't stopped. Despite everything he had done, everything he had sacrificed, the haunting premonition was unyielding. David awoke not in his comfortable bed, but in a sterile, unfamiliar room. The steady beeping of medical monitors and the faint smell of antiseptic told him he was in a hospital. His body was sore, his mind foggy, and his memory was a jumbled mess of terrifying images. As he struggled to piece together what had happened, a doctor walked into the room. He wore a solemn expression, his eyes filled with sympathy and regret. With each word that fell from his lips, David's world came crashing down. He spoke of a fire, an uncontrollable blaze that had consumed his home. He spoke of his family, Emily, Matthew, Amelia, Sam, lost to the inferno. He was the only survivor, the doctor told him, his voice barely above a whisper. The news hit David like a punch to the gut. He was alone. His family, The people he cherished more than life itself were gone. His nightmare, the horrifying premonition he had fought so desperately to prevent, had come true. The hospital room seemed to close in on him, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The beeping of the monitors echoed in his ears, the sound becoming a cruel mockery of his own survival. He was alive, but he felt as if he had died with them, in that merciless fire that had robbed him of everything he loved. The devastating revelation left him shattered, a shell of the man he used to be. The world outside continued to turn, indifferent to his loss. His nightmare had turned into a reality too cruel to bear. David was alone in a world that had mercilessly ripped his family away from him, leaving him with nothing but ashes of his once perfect life. In the stark light of the hospital room, David's world lay in ruins. The loss was so profound, so staggering, that he could hardly comprehend it. His family, his joyful, vibrant, beautiful family, was gone, swept away in a torrent of fire and smoke that had left nothing behind. And he, despite his desperate efforts, his fervent prayers, his careful precautions, had been powerless to stop it. He found himself trapped in a cruel reality, one where his worst fears had been realized. A reality that echoed with the laughter of his children, the loving whispers of his wife, now replaced by the hollow silence of their absence. It was a reality he hadn't been prepared for, a reality he didn't want to accept. The stark hospital walls bore silent witness to his agony. His cries echoed through the sterile corridors, a haunting testament to the devastating loss he had suffered. The white sheets, the cold floors, the indifferent machines monitoring his vitals, they all seemed to amplify his loneliness, magnifying the gaping hole that the loss of his family had left behind. The memory of his desperate attempts to avert this disaster flashed before his eyes. The outing, the laughter, the shared joy, they all seemed like distant memories, echoes of a life that had been brutally snuffed out. The realization that he had been living on borrowed time, that he had merely postponed the inevitable, was a bitter pill to swallow. In his heart, he had held on to the belief that he could change the course of fate. But now, confronted with the cruel reality, he realized the futility of his efforts. Fate had been a formidable opponent, one that had ruthlessly played out its cruel design, indifferent to his pleas, his efforts, his desperation. In the shadow of his loss, David was left grappling with a shattered reality. His world, once filled with laughter, love, and happiness, was now a barren wasteland, echoing with the screams of his nightmare that had become a horrifying reality. Despite his best efforts, despite his desperate fight, he had been unable to alter fate's cruel design. He was left alone, grappling with a harsh truth. No matter how hard we fight, some things are simply meant to be.